we are going to look at pollination. We want to look at pollination. What is it that we call pollination? So, we continue looking at science, and the science we're looking at plant life, but we are interested in looking at pollination. Children, pollination. But before we do that, we remind ourselves of some of the parts, and you should be able to tell your friend. Let's begin looking at our flower like this. And the part that I will be pointing at is this part here. That part. Children, do you know the name of that part? This is the flower stalk. Flower stalk. And the function is it holds the flower. It holds the flower. And then just after the flower stalk, we have this part here, the green part. This green part that protects the flower when it is at a bad stage. This part here, that part of the flower, we call it sepals. Sepals. S-E-P-A-L-S. Sepals. And then we had that brightly colored part, the part that I'm holding. Children, let's look at that. That I'm holding. They could be of different colors. There can be that. It could be this. It could be that. These parts of the flower. We call them petals. Petals. Petals is the name to this part, and we say they attract pollinators. When we open the inside our flower, children, I'm opening my flower inside, and there are the parts. There are different parts. In those parts, in the middle, there is this part of the plant that we looked at. I'll hold it up like this. There is that part of the plant we looked at. And on top, there is what we call the stigma. The stigma. Going down the stigma, we find the style. The style which goes down into the ovary. And then within the ovary, we find the ovules. The ovules. So children, those are some of the parts that we looked at of a flower. After looking at those parts, we now ask ourselves, we know that the anthers produce pollen. The anthers produce pollen. And this pollen grain has to go to the stigma. The pollen grain has to go to the stigma. Let me show you again using this flower. The anthers have the male reproductive cells called the pollen. This pollen has to move from the stigma. The pollen has to move. Pollination means the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. The transfer, you can transfer, if you have a book, if I have a ruler here, I can transfer it to another place. But this time, what are we transferring? The pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. Don't forget, children, what is pollination? Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther heads to the stigma. Pollen is moving from the anthers to the stigma. That's what we call pollination. We are heading into a very short break. When we come back, we look more into our new word called pollination. Let me see you after the break.
Time now for Fan Fact.
Welcome back from that short break, children. Before we went for the break, I had explained to you, we had seen that pollen produced in the anthers, we say pollination has taken place. So if somebody asked you, if you went home and asked mommy and said, we have learned about pollination, and he asked you, what is pollination? I do hope you'll be able to tell mommy, you'll be able to tell your brother that pollination is the transfer. That statement down, children, we are saying that pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers, or let's say from the anther heads to the stigma. Pollination thoroughly. Pollination is the transfer. We are looking at the word transfer, moving from one place to another. But what is moving? It is pollen grains. Pollen grains. Where are they coming from? From the anther heads. Anther heads to the stigma. Once that happens, we can say pollination has taken place. The pollen has moved from the anther heads to the stigma. From the anther heads to the stigma. It can be that flower, or for the case of this flower, in case it has opened up, the pollen has to move from the anther heads. It has to move from the anther heads to the stigma. Once that happens, we say pollination has taken place. Now, children, we ask ourselves, how does how does the pollen move? Does it have legs? Does it have a bicycle? Does it have a car? How does the pollen move from the anthers to wings? Those factors, those objects, the materials that help to move the pollen from the anthers to the stigma is or are what we call agents of pollination. Agents of pollination. So that one is our small topic we need to look at. Let's look at what we're calling the agents. Let's look at what we call agents of pollination. My good children, when you get the word agents, You don't need to get worried. You are asking, we are asking, what is it that can make pollen move from the anther to the stigma? And those are the ones we are calling agents of pollination, those things that help. We have very many flowers. Man, you can't go on from the anther you put on another, and then from another one, and then you do that. You move around the flowers in your whole village. You can't do that. There are some things that help. We are calling agents of pollination. And I know, children, you've seen very many of them. And I'll begin with the simplest. I know you have ever gone out, you've ever gone to a flower. When you find a beautiful flower like this, what else do you find there? When you find a flower like this, you will find some insects. Insects. So you will find there insects. And among them, there is one common friend called a bee. A bee is another good example of insects that pollinate flowers. A bee will come, fall on this flower, and as it moves away, the pollen will stick onto it. As it goes on to another flower, it leaves the pollen there. A bee. So, among the agents, we shall have one that we are calling insects. So we shall have insects. And which are some of these insects that we have? We could look at. You will find there bees. You will find there bees. You will find there wasps. They will be there. There will be beetles. You will find there the moth. You will find there a fly and very many insects. Children, you have seen these. Once they are there, they are looking for the sweet nectar. They are looking for something sweet from that flower. But in the due process, they carry along with them pollen. And therefore, insects becomes our number one. Pollinators. Pollinators. The bees, the wasps, the beetles, the moth, the butterfly. You will find them. You've seen them. And very many other insects. They are called pollinators. Children, we head into another very short break. When we come back, we continue looking at the agents of pollination. Let me see you after the break.
Do you know your plants and animals?
Welcome back from that short break, children. I know when you went for the break, you were thinking of other very many insects which help to transfer the pollen from the anthers to the insects. We look at another group of things that help us to do that. And this one is, we have number two. Number two is going to be what we call wind. Wind. What is wind? Wind is moving air. The wind will blow. And then from that direction, again it will blow. In doing that, some pollen will be blown away and it will fall onto the stigma. And the examples of such plants include these grasses. Look at the grasses, children. With these grasses, how are they pollinated? They use its wind. As the wind blows, the pollen will shake and will fall onto another flower. The grasses, look at maize. If you look at maize, as the wind blows up there, the pollen falls down onto the maize. So wind is yet another example of the agents that help to transfer pollen. Children, after looking at wind, we go to water plants. You ever gone to water? You have ever gone to a swamp? Yes, those plants, water helps to transfer the pollen from the stigma to the answer. As water is blowing with those water plants, it will help to carry the pollen. So our number 3, we shall look at what we call water. Water is yet another very good example of agents of pollination. And then we look at another one. And this one also, you've seen it at home. There are some plants, you see some birds going onto them. And the bird has a very long beak. It has a long, sometimes you can't even see it with your eyes. But as you're touching this, as you're moving, you could know that as a cow is moving, as a goat is moving around, as very many different animals are moving, they help to transfer pollen from one plant to another. So, pollination. And what is pollination again, children? Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains. Pollen, and the stigma receives the pollen. And then, what are those things that help to carry pollination? Pollen. They are the ones all those are the agents of pollination. They help to carry the pollen, as we are calling agents of pollination. We shall be pollinated by insects. We discover that in our next coming lessons. But as for now, we do come to the end of our lesson. Till we meet again, may
Sarah
From, you have a right to go to school.
It's Freaky Friday!